I'm going to start calling Destiny Buttercup. I think that's a far more original name for a stripper than Destiny. You know, I think it's a little dangerous for a Twitch streamer with an audience his size to be revising history when it comes to the 2000 presidential election. Right now, Democrats are struggling to pass voter protections before the upcoming midterms. Most of the voter suppression tactics used these days by Republicans were born out of the 2000 presidential election. To suggest that George W. Bush behaved in a democratic manner during that election is a blatant lie.
A point so self-evident and simplistic, by the way.
But there seems to be no causal link that we can draw from Jeb Bush to the state secretary that was over the election, to the election being carried out, to the judges that justified the election.
Yeah, there's no link between a Republican governor running for president, a Republican governor of Florida, a Republican secretary of state, and a Republican legislature. There's no link between any of those Republicans.
Election. There seems to be no causal link at all.
I don't know who this douchebag is, man, but he sounds like a poor man's Ben Carson. He does not sound like a brain surgeon. Sounds like a dude who eats crayons for a living.
To call this anti-democratic because none of that evidence exists, and that's what.
There's no evidence that exists that George W. Bush behaved in an anti-democratic manner. That's the claim. Remember, that's the claim. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you like an hour ago, it sounds like what you're saying is, hey, it was his brother, it's got to be something there, right? And what we're saying is that bar is so low that it's disgusting to you.
He keeps bringing up Jeb Bush. It can't be anti-democratic unless Jeb Bush was involved, because the Watergate break-in. Jeb Bush was not involved in the Watergate break-in. So does that mean the Watergate break-in was democratic? Was not anti-democratic? We keep saying it can't be a conspiracy unless Jeb Bush is involved. There was a conspiracy to assassinate Abraham Lincoln, and they seemed to be pretty successful at that, even without the help of Jeb Bush. So I don't really get this whole Jeb Bush thing, but I mean, if we're going to talk about Jeb Bush supposedly recused himself during the recount, yet made 95 phone calls to George W. Bush's campaign office. 10 of those coming directly from his phone, and to this day, he says he can't recall a single conversation that happened. But there's emails of him thanking John Roberts for John Roberts' legal advice during that time. John Roberts, who has now been appointed to the Supreme Court by George W. Bush. I don't understand what this means, lack of evidence. There was enough evidence for the Civil Rights Commission to recommend that the Justice Department sue Florida and Jeb Bush and Katherine Harris, take them to court. Of course, that never happened because the Justice Department was being run by that time by George W. Bush. But I mean, just because there's a cover-up, that doesn't necessarily mean there was a crime.
Use rhetoric as is fascistic based off
anti-democratic. Well, it's
knows that semantic game. They tried to change the subject. First, the fucking bar was anti-democratic. Then suddenly the goalpost got pushed back to fascistic. But good for Vaush for correcting that.
About using the evidence that you have to the best of your ability. You're not always going to have stuff as clear-cut as getting like this search history of the state legislators.
But we do have evidence that is that clear-cut. I mean, we know that campaigns, that elections were run a certain way in 1998, and then that way changed. They always had, since Jim Crow, they've had laws against felons voting. But the criteria or the net they were trying to cast to list who those felons were was much wider. The company that gathered the 58,000 names went to Jeb Bush and Katherine Harris and told them these criteria are not accurate enough and there are going to be mistakes. Much like if you went to a CEO and you said these airbags don't work and people could die. Is the CEO responsible? Well, I don't know. I guess a judge could decide that. But a lot of changes were made between 1998 and 2000. One major change was they used to keep affidavits. If your name was, if you were marked as a felon and you weren't a felon, you could fill out that affidavit and your vote would still count. Those affidavits were missing. And when they came across the obvious problems of the 12,000 people who were not felons but were on those lists, and they had to pick up their phone to call their supervisors, no one answered the phone. That happened over and over and over and over again. And, you know, oddly enough, although black people made up 11% of the electorate in Florida, they were 44% of them. They made up 44% of the felon lists. I think that that's direct evidence of voter suppression.
Indicating that they were looking up what types of voter IDs black people used. It's not always going to be that clear cut. So when it comes to the Bush v. Gore situation, I'm far from the first person to make this claim. It's not.
He is far from the first person to make this claim. Again, the NAACP and ACLU and the Civil Rights Commission all made this claim. Not to mention, you can Google it right now. You can see HuffPo, New York Times, The Guardian, Newsweek, Rolling Stone. Goes on and on and on and on. The reporting, you can get the report itself, the CCR report itself, for free. This is not a controversial take. Anyone who says it is selling you a dead parrot. Anyone who says otherwise has got a bridge for sale.
Just that it was convenient, and convenient it was. It was that there seemed to be no other reason to put forward the butterfly ballots, and the butterfly ballots.
The butterfly ballots are a red herring. I mean, there were votes stolen, and in a hilarious way. I mean, as I have explained previously, you had a lot of elderly Jewish people voting for Pat Buchanan, who is a Holocaust revisionist, much like Destiny, but far more of a blatant anti-Semite. It was very bizarre that he won he did so well in Palm Beach County, but that's not the real problem. The real problem was stopping the recount and the voter suppression tactics using the felon lists. And also voting machines were a problem too.
Were so specifically and oddly designed. You can look them up right now. The way they organized the listing of the candidates it wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. Nobody did it that way. And you have to think, why would they do this unbelievably weird thing? Just hear Destiny
Why would they do all of those weird things? All of those weird things. It's a collection of a pile of different incidents that all happened, not just in Florida, but in St. Louis, where George W. Bush sued to have the polls closed early in black neighborhoods, and he won.
Nobody's disagreeing, and then he's going to list a point that he was disagreeing with 5 minutes ago. Hit me with it, Destiny, please.
Okay, sure, let me explain this one more time. I literally said word for word, somebody go back and clip it. Everybody agrees that there was funny business.
He's lying. If they agreed, then they wouldn't be debating right now.
Nobody is saying that.
That's another move he likes to do. He likes to backtrack. I didn't say that, I said this. I didn't say that, I said this. And then he'll put words in somebody else's mouth. He's got a lot of little tactics, and his goal usually seems to be avoiding the truth, when these conversations should be about illuminating for his audience history.
There wasn't funny business. The problem is that you are alleging a conspiracy. This is the exact same types of arguments that you have with... insane Trump fanatics who will say things like, this particular thing happened, and the reason why was because there's a massive conspiracy behind it.
Yeah, you know what? Just check your clocks. Time him. 20 years from now, he'll be claiming that Joe Biden stole this last election. What does any of this have to do with fucking Florida?
So whether it's Fauci miscommunicating how we're supposed to...
I mean, listen, he's claiming that this is a conspiracy theory, but wait a second. What are you talking about, dude? I just listed off how many different media sources. Not to mention the ACLU, the NAACP, and the Civil Rights Commission. Are you claiming that they all conspired? That everyone, that Vaushir, we're all conspiring to create a false narrative that George W. Bush stole Florida.
Use masks, or whether it was the WHO not getting the correct information out initially about the coronavirus.
That has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
The problem is that you're taking this argument of something funny or something dumb or something that shouldn't have happened, which everybody, I think most people agree with that everything relating to the Florida ballot thing was...
No, you don't agree. You wouldn't be arguing right now.
Absolutely. And it probably led to some dumb shit happening.
Some dumb shit happening. That sounds so much like... Are you guys familiar with Jordan Peterson? Or Sam Harris? Does that sound familiar? The system works just fine. If there's something... The thing that you call injustice is just a hiccup.
A person can't justify their argument because they don't have the specifics there. I'm disappointed you didn't bring up the Brooks Brothers riots. Yeah. Like I said, I just got hyper-fixated on that because I've been on...
No, it's probably...
Wait.
that he just didn't know. There's probably a ton of shit he didn't know. I know
Okay.
because there's stuff that I don't know. He probably...
Okay, so I think what Destiny is trying to imply here is that he didn't know about the Brooks Brothers riots. He's trying to plead ignorance here, and I'm not buying it for one fucking second. I don't believe him that he didn't know about that Destiny doesn't know about the Brooks Brothers riot. I think that he has all of this information. I think his goal here is to normalize voter suppression for his audience. But real quick, otherwise, and this is how I know, he would check his facts before he said them. He's been busted before for saying untrue things. Now, if he were honest, he would change his behavior and actually look up these things before he talks about them. So my assumption is his goal is to normalize voter suppression for his audience. Otherwise, if I'm wrong, he will prove it by getting on here and apologizing and correcting all the disinformation that he sold.
Probably saw it in his chat later and he's like, oh yeah, I should have brought that up because I totally knew about that at the time. No, you probably didn't. It's fine. You saw it in chat later. And chat is like your version of this is what I thought of in the shower. I wish I could have said it during the conversation.
The panel for 4 hours, and I was getting super dogpiled towards the end, so it was hard to keep all that stuff in mind. But the Brooks Brothers riot, by the way, in case you guys didn't know, was literally a riot to stop the recount in Florida, and there were Republican electors that attended that riot. And it succeeded. They stopped it. There were also...
The recount was stopped because the Supreme Court voted against, or voted in favor of Bush's stay for the recount.
He's lying. So, it wasn't just Republican electors. There were, we're talking about aides, senatorial aides. Aides in the Senate, aides in Congress, GOP aides. Flown down along with operatives that the IRS proved were paid by the Bush campaign. Flown down to create the false impression of an organically created riot. And by the way, it was not just a riot, it was a full-on attack. Similar to what happened in November 6th, but nowhere near that scope. No one died, luckily, but people came close to dying. A lot of people were physically attacked, beaten. And the goal was to stop the recount. There were voting machines that did not pick up, Diebold voting machines that did not pick up votes. So they were trying to manually count those votes to figure out who these people, if they could figure out who these people were trying to vote for. They were hand counting machine votes. The margins went from about 1,700 to roughly about 537, which was the difference in the end. That recount was physically stopped in Miami-Dade County by this mob of paid operatives. Then the board, the election board, short time later, stopped the recount officially as a result of the press coverage that came from that riot. The vote was then certified prematurely by Katherine Harris, co-chair, Secretary of State, and co-chair of George W. Bush's campaign. And then Al Gore took it to the Florida Supreme Court, which said you have to continue this count. Then George W. Bush appealed it to his Republican-led Supreme Court, who in a very close race decided to send it back to the courts for further examination. But by then, the riots happened on the 22nd. November 26th was the deadline. The deadline had been reached. And so Gore, who probably could have kept fighting, conceded. No one's saying Democrats aren't pussies. They're saying that Republicans are cheaters.